Hello, I'm Meher Ali. I am here with you with a new segment that I'm hosting. It's called The Lonely Goat Cafe. It's a lot of different things, but mainly it explores immigrant life from a mental health perspective and looking at how immigrants and folks from immigrant and marginalized communities experience loneliness, and then how they use art, music, literature, and film to find community and to move through this experience of loneliness. So I'll be bringing in folks who work in nonprofits that focus on mental health care, but also artists, poets, and filmmakers. I am so pleased to have with me today MT Vallarta. They are a poet and assistant professor of ethnic studies at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. They are the author of the poetry collection What You Refuse to Remember. I love that title, which was the winner of the 2022 Small Harbor Publishing Laureate Prize. MT has received fellowships from Lambda Literary, Kundiman, Martha's Vineyard Institute of Creative Writing, Abode Press, and Roots, Wounds, Words. Welcome, MT.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
I'm curious to know, when I spoke to you about this podcast and, now what I was talking about, folks from immigrant and marginalized communities and all of that, did anything resonate with you, or is there anything that you want to share how you felt when I spoke about this segment?
When I heard the description of this segment, I was just like, yes, we need to have these conversations about migration and the loneliness that comes from it. I'm actually not sure what my generation is because, technically I'm second generation because I was born in the United States. But then some of my friends say that I'm actually 1.5 because even though I was born in the States, I was raised in the Philippines from age 2 to 4. And those years in the Philippines were very foundational to my development as a young child. And I only spoke Tagalog at home. When my family returned to the States, I didn't speak English. I had to take ESL classes, and I remember that moment of, not understanding what was happening in the classroom and being, singled out as the only kid in kindergarten who didn't know how to speak English, who had to go to the English as a second learner classes. That was a very, very lonely feeling. And this was suburban New Jersey before my family moved to Los Angeles, California.
Wow. Yeah, as you were speaking, I immediately went to my own experience of learning to speak English, which was so oppressive. I feel kind of connected with what you were saying because even for me, in terms of just migration in general, I've moved around so much. The first time out of India was when my family moved to Nigeria and I was admitted into an American school. That was the first time that I had to speak English, which was at the age of 13. Mm-hmm. Because before that, in India, it is an English medium, quote-unquote, school, but we speak in Hindi, and so, it was so terrifying to articulate myself in English, and I got bullied for my accent. And so I changed my accent. And that's a really funny story. Maybe I'll put I don't know if I want to share it on public radio, but, this experience of loneliness, for me, it's also connected to bullying. Mm-hmm. Prior to that, I had friends, and I had never felt this kind of inferiority, at not being able to speak a language. And that was the first experience that I had when I went into that school. And, I was just I don't speak English, so I'm lesser than these students. I was made to feel that. So, yeah. So interesting, because now you write primarily in English?
Yeah, now I write poetry in English. I do write in Tagalog sometimes, but very rarely. And I think what poetry affords me to do is to experiment and play and even mutilate the English language.
I love that
in my own way, because in poetry, yes, certainly there's more traditional forms like sonnets, pantones, villanelles, where you have to follow a certain type of form or meter or rhyming scheme. But as a poet, you're allowed to experiment with those forms and break away from tradition. So in many ways, like, being a poet is also learning how to craft language for your own sake, to figure out how you can use, this hegemonic dominant language to communicate what's so difficult for migrants, for people of color to communicate in the first place. So poetry allows me to share what I can't easily share in plain English or even in Tagalog.
Do you want to share one of your poems with us?
Yeah, thank you. So this poem is from my poetry collection, What You Refuse to Remember. It's called When You Don't Get Enough REM Sleep. I have dreams of turning into a broom, sweeping away the debris we call family. My mother said I should have been born the eldest, but instead I am wedged between a shovel and a machete. My grandfather was a ticket dispatcher at a bus station. He inhaled smoke until his lungs collapsed. My grandmother bore 11 children. One died and she sighed from relief. After several years, I have finally stopped biting my nails, but now I am obsessed with slowing out the dirt beneath them. My dentist said I should use an extra soft toothbrush. I stopped taking edibles and now take 2 buspirone with my tea. My older sister pitches natural remedies, and somewhere in my chamomile sleep, I chortle. I pitch a tent under lucky paper stars. I sleep with a jar of dust, cradling a $5 bill and fly swatter.
Wow.
Thank you.
It's so visual, and so many different aspects of your life and your relationships coming together to form this beautiful poem. Do you often explore relationships and family, especially in your poems? What is the pull when you write a poem? What are the things that you like to explore?
I definitely explore family and relationships a lot. So, even though I speak my parents' native language, there's still an incredible generational divide and cultural divide between us. And sometimes I feel like I write poems so I can tell my parents the things that I would never really tell them in a normal conversation. We do talk about, my grandparents in the Philippines who have passed, and I can tell that, my parents have never really healed or let go of the trauma of migration, and I feel like my mom and dad are just inherently lonely because of that, but they don't want to talk to me about it. So I write poems as a way to kind of imagine what does it mean to be to also be a lonely individual and to be in kinship with both of my lonely parents together. How do I make sense of that kinship? And is there a way that we can still feel close, or I can kind of lay out our kinship, our bonds, in a more concrete way outside of just talking to them or saying I love you, which isn't really a thing in a lot of immigrant families. Yeah, so for me, that care and that commitment to kinship with my parents comes out in poetry.
When you said trauma of migration, that was really interesting to me that you used the word trauma. My experience coming here has been that things are going well, and then I just feel this deep sense of nostalgia and displacement, and I don't know where it comes from, but it just hits me, and I'm not able to make sense of it. Then my brain starts working in the pros and cons. Is your life better here than there? Then what's the problem? You know what I mean? But the heart, it's feels it, it's a push. So I don't know if you're comfortable, but do you want to share a little bit more about this experience of your parents or your family's trauma of migration, the way that you articulated it?
Yeah, I think, for my parents, Because there's this sense that, like, oh, once you migrate, all your problems are going to be solved. You're going to have a better life for yourself and your kids. And, you know, that's the narrative that the U.S. feeds migrants, the American dream. But for my parents, you know, we've had this conversation before, and my parents agree that for them, like the typical American dream of upward mobility, of eventually obtaining like a middle class salary, buying a house, like none of those immigrant aspirations ever came true for them. You know, my parents still live in the same 2-bedroom apartment that I grew up in. My dad is retired now, but he still works part-time as like a restaurant worker. My mom has been a house mom, you know, housewife ever since she came to the United States. And yeah, they always say that in many ways, maybe life would have been better in the Philippines, but they decided to take this risk because when my parents were coming of age in the Philippines at the time, President Ferdinand Marcos was a dictator, and he had passed martial law, and there was a lot of corruption and graft and day-to-day violence that Filipino citizens were facing. So that was kind of like the push for my parents to come to the U.S. and seek like a better life for their children. Seeing how, you know, the landscape of U.S. politics is, you know, not as great as people make it out to be. Just looking at who our current president is right now and seeing all the rights being stripped from migrants and queer folks and Palestinians, my parents are just like, yeah, you know, we took a risk. And yeah, in some ways, things are better here, but in other ways, it might have also been better if we stayed because our family is there, and I'm pretty sure we would have found a way to make things do. But, you know, we can't go back. We can't reverse the decision. And my parents also recognize that it's been a privilege to raise my sisters and I here in the U.S. because we were exposed and had access to opportunities that we wouldn't have had otherwise in the Philippines. Like most youth in the Philippines, once they graduate from college, they either have to go through this very long job hunt so they can stay at home, or most likely they will have to work abroad and be an OFW, an overseas Filipino worker. And my parents didn't want that lack of options for my sisters and me. Like, they wanted us to be able to have as much autonomy as possible in deciding what we wanted to do in the future. So that in itself was a privilege that I was able to access as an American citizen, as someone who was raised in the U.S. But at the same time, I can't ever let go of like this nostalgia that I have for the homeland, especially since I grew up there as a child, and it was a treat to see my aunts and uncles and my cousins every single day, to always have someone to play with, to talk to have people who looked like you, who spoke your language around you. That was really nice, and I miss that still.
So I wanted to actually read a poem by Linton Kwesi Johnson, who I believe is a British Jamaican poet. The reason why I thought of it was because you were speaking about language, and then, what was the word you used? Twisting it or
mutilating it?
Mutilating it. I'm just going to read the first 3 stanzas of it. When me just come to London town, me used to work pon the underground. But working pon the underground, you don't get to know your way around. England is a bitch, there's no escaping it. England is a bitch, there's no running away from it. Me get a licking job in the hotel, and after a while, me was doing quite well. Them start me off as a dishwasher, but when me take a stack, me not take clackwatcher. England is a bitch, there's no escaping it. England is a bitch, no matter try to hide from it. So that was the best that I could do.
That was really good.
Thank you. Immigrants and descendants of immigrants in this country, and I'm particularly speaking about folks from marginalized communities here in the United States, we always have this kind of feeling of like, what if? Mm-hmm. Because as you said, like the quote-unquote American dream is not for everyone. So like there is always this possibility of another life, like almost like a parallel universe. And you imagine yourself living there as well as here. At the same time, like there is a sense of community that we have, or maybe we long for. What does the word community mean for you, and how have you experienced it in this country? And then also, like, you know, you talk about Philippines. How have you experienced community in that country?
I think I was able to find kinship with other Filipinos when I came to college. Because in LA, I grew up in a predominantly Latinx neighborhood. So growing up, most of my friends were Mexican or Guatemalan or Salvadorian. And I actually didn't realize that Filipinos were Asian. Until like in elementary school, when my teacher told me, like, you know, the Philippines is in Asia, like you're not Latina, you're Asian. And I was just like, but there's so many like cultural commonalities between like Latinx folks and Filipinx folks. Yeah, like I just felt this sense of kinship with my Latinx peers because most of us, or if not all of us, were raised Catholic. We all had pretty strong family values and family ties. Many of us would also go home to like our homelands too every once in a while, and we would talk about what it was like to go on those trips. So that's kind of how I was able to find kinship with other descendants of immigrants. And in college, that was the very first time where I was able to be around other Filipinx people that were my age. And even though I felt seen because there were people who looked like me and understood more specific like cultural references, it was still pretty lonely because a lot of the Filipinos at UC Berkeley where I attended came from more affluent backgrounds. They were more middle class. Parents had houses. A lot of them also were English speaking, like monolingual. They didn't speak Tagalog. There was still that sense of loneliness for me where like, oh, even though I'm around Filipinos, there aren't really a lot of Filipino folks here who have the same background or the same experience as me. And yeah, it was really hard to relate to some of my Filipino peers because many of them hadn't even been to the Philippines either, or just weren't as fluent in Filipino culture as I was. Yeah, there was still that sense of like I wasn't on my own like island.
Yeah, I'm curious to know, how do you experience loneliness?
In my body, I tend to feel it in my stomach and in my chest. Like there's this sinking feeling in my core, and I describe it as like, oh, I want to like curl up into a ball and just sink. That's how I experience loneliness somatically. And I think I associate loneliness with nostalgia too, just like a lot of immigrants do, this sense of what if. And I think there's also this sense of not just what if, but if only. Like if only we stayed, if only. Like in college, I used to think like, oh, if only I, had more money, or maybe I would have more friends and I would be able to relate to my peers more. To me, loneliness is this wish for something that you don't have.
I basically asked you to bring a poem that resonated with you, that maybe helps you to feel a sense of community or connection.
Yeah, so the poem I brought is by Hala Alian. She is a Palestinian-American poet, and I'm just in love with her work. And this poem is titled I'm Not Speaking First, which was published in The Rumpus. Please, I wore the mascara for myself to remind my eyes they're green. December, old friends for an afternoon, and still I remembered you like Beirut. Unmade beds, Marlboros, a thing that never wanted me. Nowadays, I can nest my husband's grief inside me like a Russian doll. The smallest one is a black oval seed. Maybe I was wrong. You wanted me thin, so I ate. You wanted me sober, so I drank. I've always liked my lies. When something pressed against me, I took it fast. I don't have to tell you twice. Listen. I know I've made a mess of everything. I know it's too late. I've stood on your balcony, 25 floors above the cars and billboards and dunes, my eyes suddenly filling, but instead of speaking, God, that chain link against my back, you cradling the billiard ball you taught me to hit, I spat. A full mile to the ground. You know me. I'll spin my bruised hip bone into an affair. I'll play with your new daughter until the sun sets. Back in Manhattan, when I do dream, it's of octopi, tentacles